What are the kind of things the government probably shouldn't do? Well, bashing the energy companies may be popular these days, and everyone loves to hate Exxon, but it's not going to do much good. The sad fact is that at present, 80 to 90% of world oil is controlled by the national oil companies, the National Oil Company of Iran, the National Oil Company of Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and so forth. The international oil companies, the Shells, the Exxons, the BPs of the world, don't have access or very limited access to most of the world's oil these days. Another reason they're going to such lengths investing in places like the Gulf of Mexico where they have some access. Price controls, gasoline rationing, allocation controls are probably the worst of all worlds, but that's one of the first things we unfortunately may see. Government picking winners and losers, I think very much should be avoided. The government, neither government nor anybody else can, ahead of time, has any good track record of picking winners and losers. There's a very good chance that the winners the government picks will probably end up being the losers. The avoidance of spurious regulations, odd-even fueling days, speed limits, micro-fuel restrictions in the U.S. in the 70s. We passed laws saying you couldn't use natural gas to produce electricity. Local jurisdictions did pass laws saying you couldn't use natural gas to heat swimming pools. Totally unenforceable, of course. I think the bottom line is that government intervention that is highly unpopular with the public simply won't work. There are, of course, some important issues that the government must address. There's a current shortage of just about everything you need in the energy sector in terms of physical resources, financial resources, and especially human resources. We recall that massive commercial crash programs are rare and they rarely succeed. The startup of any of these projects we're talking about on the demand side or the supply side will be much slower and probably cost a lot more than we anticipate. One concern of special import here, I think, is it's not clear how environmental protection will fare once the crisis occurs. When people don't have a job and are freezing to death in the dark, can't drive their cars, what are they going to feel about environmental protection? Will they care about CO2 or greenhouse gases or climate change? Who knows? Most of my talk here is obviously on the peak oil question. It can't be divorced from the question of climate change. Climate change and peak oil are probably the two most long-term intractable energy and environmental problems the world faces. I'll just say here that it's a mistake to try to address either one of them independently. You can't focus exclusively on climate change without worrying or considering peak oil and vice versa. If you do, you're going to get very bad policy. Hey, there's plenty of time to address our problem. Why worry now? Absolutely not true. Time may have already run out to avoid serious problems. The good news is that viable mitigation options exist. However, if we wait until we reach the point of peaking, it will be too late by years and probably decades. Thus, if oil peaking occurs within the next decade or sooner, as many of the top experts feel, we, the world, Australia, U.S., you name it, are in very serious trouble. Action is required immediately. Now, why do we say this? Let's do a very simple exercise here. We'll take the U.S. profile and just make a triangle out of it, that dotted line, and say this is about what the world oil production, peaking of world oil production will look like. It'll go up, it'll reach a maximum, and then it'll decline. Again, very simple here. You see the decline pattern, and here we've hypothesized that oil production will peak at about 100 million barrels a day. The world is currently consuming about 86 or 87 million barrels a day. This is not a forecast. 100 is a very easy number to work with. The world will be going along at increasing demand for, increasing it economically at about 2 or 3% a year. Demand for oil increasing 1.5%, 2% a year. It'll want to continue to do this to keep the economies of the world growing. When oil peaks, of course, the oil won't be there, and neither world oil consumption nor economic growth can continue. You have the shaded triangle there is, for lack of a better word, a shortage. Here we've made some very conservative assumptions that demand will continue to increase, other things being equal, at about 2%, and oil would decline at about 2% a year. We ran 3 scenarios. We looked at, first of all, what it would take to remedy the problem if you waited until peaking before you did anything. We found that you've got shortages continuing forever. Now, why is this? I mentioned earlier that even if you tomorrow introduced mandatory fuel efficiency standards to increase vehicle fuel efficiency by 50% or 60%, it would take 15 years at least, because of the vehicle vintage and turnover of that, before you make an appreciable dent either in the U.S. or the world's oil consumption. So you have to start at least 10 or 12 years in advance to get any measurable benefits from demand reduction in the vehicle fleet. What if you tried to do the work on the supply side, start building substitute fuel plants such as coal to liquids plants, oil shale plants, gas to liquid plants, going big for enhanced oil recovery, all of which are biomass plants, whatever you choose. These take decades to come into effect as well. For example, in the United States, if you wanted to build a modest-sized coal to liquid plant of 30,000 barrels a day, it would take you at least 2 or 3 years to get it sited, permitted, go through the environmental impact statement business, et cetera. Then you have to start building the thing. You have 4 years of construction. So it's at least 7 years out, but from the time you start till the time you're producing 1 barrel of substitute fuel. But you'd have to multiply this plant by several hundred for the U.S. alone to make an appreciable dent in the liquid fuel consumption of the United States, which is currently 22 million barrels a day and is forecast to increase to 28 million barrels a day by 2030. There's no way you can do that, not to mention the costs and the difficulties. We're just talking about the time involved. There's no way you can do any of these mitigation initiatives on the demand side or the supply side in less than about 10 to 12 to 15 years at a minimum. And that's if everything goes right. Let's say we start these mitigation options 10 years in advance. In other words, where the governments are very wise and they see the problem coming in 2017 or 2018 and start doing things now. Would that solve the problem? Well, it would make it a lot better, but even by the 7th or 8th year, you can't run fast enough to keep up with the decline in oil production. And by the 7th or 8th year, you've got shortages beginning to appear that get worse every year. Finally, what if you started 20 years in advance, the world started 20 years in advance, then you may have a handle on solving the problem. In other words, if we think that oil production is going to peak around 2010, we should have started doing something about 1990. Obviously, we didn't. We haven't. None of the governments of the world, with perhaps the possible exception of the Chinese, have even begun to address this in an aggressive manner now. Is why I said earlier that even if the optimists are right, that oil peaking doesn't occur until around 2020, about 12 or 13 years from now, we still have a very serious problem. So the results, the summary is simple. Waiting for oil peaking is the worst possible policy. Starting 10 years early is better, but shortages still develop. You've got to start at least 2 decades in advance. There's simply no quick fix. And all this diagram shows that what you can get from various mitigation options compared to the rate of decline of oil. We use a 2% decline. Geologists tell us that most oil wells decline a lot faster than that, 4%, 6% a year. 2% is bad enough, but if the decline rates are greater than that, then the world is really, really in trouble because there's no way you can replace that amount of oil. For example, we hypothesize that it happens at 100 million barrels a day. If the decline rate is 2 million barrels a day, that means that the first year after peaking, you have to come up with an additional 2 million barrels, not to increase the supply of oil for the world, just to keep it constant at 100 million. The second year, you need 4 million barrels a day. The third year, you need 6 million barrels a day. I just told you earlier to construct a modest-sized coal to liquids plant in the United States at 30,000 barrels a day takes 7 years. We're talking 7 years out times 2. That's 14 million barrel shortage. You do the numbers, and it's mind-boggling. If the decline rate is 4% a year, you need 4 million additional barrels the first year, 8 million the second, and so forth. That's not to increase the supply of oil. That's to keep it from declining further. We like to say that there are 2 kinds of risks here. They're highly asymmetric. Let's say you start some of these mitigation options on both the demand side and the supply side a couple of years earlier than you really have to. Well, there are opportunity costs and resource costs involved. However, look at the other side of the graph. If you delay them by a couple of years, the costs involved are much higher by a factor of 8 or 10. So again, the risk factors here are highly asymmetric. It's better to start early and be wrong than delay and start late and be wrong. If you want more to worry about, look at this. Consider the shortfall. Assume oil peaks at about 100 million barrels a day, declining at 2% a day. In 20 years, the shortfall is 80% of current world oil consumption. So within 20 years, we could be out 80% of 85 million barrels a day, whatever we are consuming at the present time. Again, you run the numbers with some simple calculations, and it's extremely worrying and depressing. I'd like to spend a minute on this chart. I'm getting close to the end now, and then I want to talk about some implications for the supply chain business. What are the implications of what I've just said here? Been talking about the costs and benefits of liquid fuel requirements, the implications thereof. How do we interpret this? Well, we can try to calculate what do we need to maintain the current energy regime. If the world is now consuming 87 million barrels a day, and then will need by 2020 115 or 120 million barrels a day or more, how do you make up that difference in terms of coal to liquid plants, oil shale, oil sands, so forth? And let me talk about oil sands just for a minute. People always tell you, well, look, the Canadians are producing 1 million barrels a day now of oil from oil sands. Why can't they just ramp that up? You know, it's taken the Canadians 38 years to get to 1 million barrels a day from oil sands. They're mammoth operations. There is a physical, financial, and environmental limit and energy-wise limitation to what they can do. Just an example of how long and difficult it is.